Okay, thank you very much for bearing with us. Very exciting annual meeting. Super happy to wrap it up with this topic dear and close to my heart, which is the idea of open policy analysis. And we have a stellar panel with us this evening to discuss these ideas. I will be moderating. My name is Fernando Oces de la Guardia. We have with us a researcher, Hilary Hoynes. She's a leading researcher from UC Berkeley, a professor of public policy and economics. Her work is in highly policy relevant topics like tax policy, inequality, and poverty. We have Matt Jensen from the Open Source Policy Center at the American Enterprise Institute at Washington, D.C. They have very interesting initiatives on how to perform open policy analysis in tax policy and advocate for different open source policy initiatives in the US. Here with us also we have Josh Rosenberg. He's a senior research analyst at GitWell, an organization that is fully committed to disclose all of their analysis, and they do they rank charities and provide recommendations for donations, and they have very interesting work in their by disclosing the cost-benefit analysis they do in open spreadsheets out in the open. And remotely is joining us Kevin Paris. He's a senior analyst from the Congressional Budget Office. The CBO, for those outside of the US, it's a government agency that provides policy analysis to Congress on the effects of different legislations on the US economy and the federal budget. They are all going to giving us their perspective on how research connects with policy, especially Hilary, and then the three that perform policy analysis, they're going to explain us what are they doing in this field in terms of openness. And on my side, I'm just going to give you a little bit of a framework for the discussion or conversation that we're going to be having. And the key motivation that I wanted to start with is why do we even care about bringing open science practices into policy analysis? And this is the mental map that we have in our head. So the idea is that researchers go out in the world and generate some type of general purpose knowledge. That knowledge, it's ideally published in a peer-reviewed journal and stored for general usage. And then policy analysts take some of that analysis, some of that research as an input, combine it with other components, and generate specific policy reports meant to inform specific policy debates. The key distinction between research and policy analysis in this case is that the policy analysis is an empirical analysis that is meant to inform a specific client. This could be Congress, the president, a specific interest group. And we're all about bringing openness to research, but when it comes to policy analysis, pretty much this still remains a large black box. We think that this is a concern because there's good policy analysis out there and there's bad policy analysis out there, meaning lacking rigor and more advocacy oriented. And with these levels of opaqueness, it's hard to distinguish them between both. There's also many of analyses that are repeated across agencies and across countries that could be benefit from more automation or could learn easy from each other. And from the researcher's perspective, there's a lot of gains in terms of understanding how the marginal piece of research might affect a policy estimate. And basically, our proposal is to take this black box and open it up in the following way. So we think in terms of layers. The first layer that we have in mind is that instead of having a 200-page report or competing 200-page reports for policymakers to consume, the idea would be one figure, one output, one graph for policymakers to make their normative decisions and take that as the starting facts. And it could be something like this. This is for the case of doing a cost-benefit analysis in deworming. The idea is that the role of the researchers and analysts would be to produce this figure and say, okay, from now on, policymakers, you decide with this is the median net present value, and that's where the zero is, and this is the distribution. The second layer for that would be to acknowledge that this depends on a set of assumptions and inputs. So to make it clear, we would have the same figure with an interactive tool right next to it. That basically you change the underlying assumptions and parameters and see how the figure changes. So in an ideal world, everybody arrives to the table with the same figure. In a second best ideal world, people might arrive with different figures, but at least instead of discussing 200-page report versus 200-page report, now we're discussing parameter A7 of your assumptions versus my parameter A7. The third layer, and this is more oriented towards staffers or advisors of decision makers. This is more oriented towards policy analysts. So the idea is that the report should be more of a dynamic document that has the complete model that describes everything that happens, embedded with the code, with the output in one place for people to be able to critically appraise the methodology. And at the very end, you will see also so that will be the key result, the underlying code that is behind that key result, and of course, the end is the figure where the policymakers start. And the bottom layer, it would be an idea of complete computational reproducibility, and this is basically that there should be a master folder or a repository somewhere out there containing all the elements underlying the analysis, and people should be able to easily download that complete folder, open it up in their own computers, and with a minimal amount of clicks, perform full computational reproducibility, linking to where we were talking in the previous conversation. So just a few clicks, and you get the next layer up, which would be the dynamic document. So that's a little bit of our vision of open policy analysis. That's the north. It feels it's ambitious, but yeah, and we don't want to generate anxiety in terms of that we're very far away from it. We want to get there, and for that we have a set of high-level principles. The idea of open output referred to the first two layers, open analysis referred to the third layer, and open materials or computational reproducibility. And we have a set of specific recommendations that, similar to the top guidelines, provide a step-by-step process on how to increase in the desired layer how to get there. And that's our plan, our high-level plan for open policy analysis. In addition to a framework, we have these draft guidelines that there's a very preliminary draft out there that we have, and we're happy to circulate with people to build something similar to the top guidelines for policy analysis. Another important part of our plan is to develop case studies, work with policy agencies to open up examples of this, to show that we see a short-term cost to this, an entry cost, but we see long-term benefits. So to generate some examples, in deworming, I have a proof of concept example for the minimum wage, and basically build up a library of this type of exercises to open up the way. Additional to what we do here at BITS in training students and researchers, we want to train public policy students and policy analysts in this way. And our fourth point is to raise awareness. And part of raising awareness is we have written a paper making the case for this, but we want to generate this type of instances. We want to have this panel. We want to talk with people who are leading the way in taking steps towards open policy analysis. Josh in the NGO space, Matt in the think tank space, Kevin in the governmental agency space, and Hillary, she can give us her perspective as a leading researcher that provides inputs for policy. Thank you very much, and with that I will leave you with Hillary.
Can I talk up there?
Yeah!
Thank you. I simply can't talk sitting down. I don't know, it's just like a physical thing. I simply can't talk sitting down. So thanks for having me. It's really interesting to be part of this panel that I'm sure I have a lot to learn about. I thought I would sort of try to do two things in my 4 minutes. And one of them, a lot of what I wanted to talk about was actually sort of part of what the last presentation was, so maybe I'll do 2.5 things. And I think for me, while I'm very excited by what was just laid out as a North Star for where we might go, it feels very, very far away from where we are today. And so I want to, like, in my world of trying to find low-hanging fruit, sort of, for me, a critical element for getting started is data. And so one of the themes I want to talk about today has to do with the fact that we have so far to go, at least in the world that I know best, which is the US federal governmental system. So the first thing I wanted to talk just briefly about was where I learned a lot about this was on this Commission on Evidence-Based Policymaking that I had the pleasure, I guess, to serve on. And it was a real education for me. So in retrospect, I'm really happy that I have the opportunity to be on this commission. So how many people in the room have heard of the Commission on Evidence-Based Policymaking? I would think at a BITS annual meeting, a lot of people would know about this, but this was a bipartisan commission that was put into practice, put into play in the later days of the Obama administration through legislation that was co-sponsored by Paul Ryan and Patty Murray from the Senate. And so there was a commission that was then formed by members of Congress and the president, and we were meant to address issues around how to improve evidence-based policymaking in the federal government. And so one of the things that was a takeaway for me as to enter this conversation is that, I'm going to make this up, but possibly 80% of the time that we spent in this commission, in our deliberation, in our public hearings, in our writing up, in our report, was about data and not about the process of research getting into evidence building per se. And so we ended up with the vision of our report was the commission envisions a future in which rigorous evidence is created efficiently, and this is really critical for what I want to talk about, as a routine part of government operations and used to construct effective public policy. And so in our report, we sort of laid out 3 different buckets of recommendations. And the bucket where I said we spent most of our time was about the benefits and the way forward to try to improve data in the federal government. And so I learned something that maybe many people in this room know, which is there's something like 2,500 rules and regulations that govern the sharing, or lack thereof, of data in the United States. So most countries have a single statistical agency, Stats Canada or Stats Norway. We've got, 13 statistical agencies across the US government? Major statistical agencies across the US government. And the data that's produced in those statistical agencies, like the Department of Education, the Department of Labor, et cetera, do not have to share their data across others. And in fact, me as a researcher came to this commission with the eyes of how can we produce better research by having better access to data. That was my own little private, interest in this commission. But one of the things that really I learned on day one was the fact that even people working in government can't get access to the data that we all would think would be like step 0 to being able to do evidence-based policymaking. Example, suppose the Department of Education makes a change to student loan policy. What would be the first thing you might want to look at? How it changes, what kinds of careers people go into, and what their earnings are. Something just simple, basic, just descriptive statistics. And those kinds of data sharing agreements could take years to generate between the IRS and the Department of Education, despite the fact that this is the federal government. Never mind the fact that there are 50 states that basically are generating the data. So for example, a program I spend a lot of time and interest in, the food stamp program, is a fully federal program, paid for out of the USDA, fully federal program, except local administration. But because the administration happens locally and the states, or in California, the counties collect the data, it does not get reported up. So the USDA does not have microdata census data on food stamp recipients for Americans. It's just, it's kind of mind-boggling. So that was a long little tangent, but the point is that you can't get started with anything without the data. And we have so far to go on the data process that that's just where my head is. So that's like point one. Point two is, because Fernando kind of prompted me to think about myself as a trainer, an educator. And so how do we help the next generation of policy analysts have the tools to try to do more along the lines of what he just had in his presentation? And I guess I need to solve that. I need to go backwards a couple steps and solve the problem of how the educators, the people like my colleague Rucker in the back of the room or myself, what we can bring to these students in terms of doing this training. And the little bit of the lesson that I wanted to say, to talk about, and this is what I don't need to say much about given the last presentation, is the importance of incentives and the importance of carrots and sticks. Because it's hard to adjust to new normals. But the thing about that American Economic Association 2005 change for the AEA journals, which we just learned are imperfect, but that got us a long way by requiring that in order to submit a paper to the AEA journals, you need to do this data posting is the beginning of something. And having those kinds of incentives/requirements to get old people like me to change is absolutely critical. And I don't know how I'm going to train my students until I get the training myself. So one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about and talking to people like Lars and Katie and others about is how we can kind of bring together bits and all the human capital and training that this organization has with clients like the AEA to set up opportunities and workshops that are built off of our annual meetings to try to get people in there and to incentivize them in through, something. Pay them, get them in, train them on these tools. So that's number two. And if you want to hear more about where the AEA version 2.0 is going, you don't just need to talk to Lars, who's our new data editor and who's trying to move us collectively as the economics profession to the next stage beyond the kinds of things that they were evaluating in the last session. So then the last thing I wanted to say, and this is prompted a little bit by another one of the prompts that I got about what to talk to you about, which was, quote, policy-oriented researchers can be blindsided by how their research is specifically used for policy analysis. Respond. I decided I didn't really want to tell a story about that because that just seemed a little too navel-gazing, but I did come up with a really concrete example that I think gets me back to the beginning and the power of data. So I study poverty and inequality, particularly in the US, and we have an official poverty measure in the United States that's released every September that is essentially the same poverty measure was originally developed in 1963 with good old Molly Orshansky and the Social Security Administration coming up with America's first poverty measure. And that today is still the poverty measure that is used in all flows of resources between federal and state and local governments, like Title I payments to schools or eligibility for public programs. And anyone who spends any time thinking about poverty knows that this measure is very out of date. Critically, the measure of resources that's used to measure official poverty in America includes cash income before tax. That means that all of the in-kind social safety net that we have in the United States, such as food stamps, housing vouchers, and the earned income tax credit, don't count as resources. And so for a long time, we had this measure, it was released every year, and people like me or other poverty researchers would have their own measure of some kind of like better measure, a shadow measure that you would put out to try to reflect real resources that we think are more reflective of American households. But that would just be one person, it'd be Hillary's measure or, Tim Smeating's measure or whoever. And that can't get you very far. So what happened was a very long-time poverty researcher named Rebecca Blank, who was working in the Census Department, in the Commerce Department, essentially put through a new poverty measure, which is called the Supplemental Poverty Measure. It was based on a National Academy of Science recommendations. And now in September or October every year, we simultaneously release official poverty and this new supplemental poverty measure. And the supplemental poverty measure does a lot. It's not perfect, but it does a lot to update the old measure. And so the lesson in that is that we're no longer having arguments that say something like, geez, we pour all this money in the social safety net, and look, the poverty measure just keeps going up and up and up. We're wasting all these resources. And instead, we've got a measure that comes out, and in that document has simple calculations, not perfect, not causal estimates, but simple calculations that say, how many elders does Social Security remove from poverty? Turns out it's like in the two-digit millions. How many children are removed from poverty because of the Earned Income Tax Credit? And by releasing this on par with official poverty, with sort of typical simple calculations, we now have raised the bar, at least at the starting point of how we would have a conversation about how might we change things in America to try to reduce child poverty. And we've got a measure that is everybody's agreed upon is a measure. May not be perfect, but we all know what it is. We can point to it. We can go to the Census Department and say what it is. So basically my bottom line is I'm excited about this North Star, but I think there's a lot to do on the data front, which is more pedestrian, but I think a critical first step to get us there. Thank you.
So a bit of background first. I'm Director of Open Source Policy Center at the American Enterprise Institute. At AEI, we spend a lot of time working with federal policymakers. Either they come to us to ask us about how to better achieve their policy priorities, or we go to them to lecture them about what their policy priorities ought to be. Open Source Policy Center, we founded about 2013. In 2012, 2011, I'd been working in tax policy with a fairly senior member of the Ways and Means Committee. From this experience and from the experience of a lot of my colleagues working with policymakers, it has and was fairly obvious that a major impediment to high quality policy was that the policymakers did not actually have tools to predict what the effects of the policies that they were proposing would be. Yes, the Congressional Budget Office and the Joint Committee on Taxation provide estimates, but oftentimes those estimates are only provided to the leaders of the committees of jurisdiction, and oftentimes they're only provided after a significant delay. The senior member of the Ways and Means Committee, the tax writing committee, this guy's job was to write taxes. There were a couple of occasions where we spent over 6 to 8 months waiting for an estimate of the budgetary impact of a tax bill. And it's a huge impediment to policy making, especially for the rank and file members who probably have less developed priors about what the effects of policy will be, and they're the people who have the least access to the CBO and JCT estimators. And so what we did, and we had very similar thought process to what Fernando has, which is that, well, it'd be really nice if there were some open policy tools and people could use them. And we started to incubate some of these tools at OSPC. One of them, which I'll show you, just so you can get a flavor, is a suite of tax models with a nice GUI interface, which you can access at ospc.org/taxbrain. Where we have the kind of Google mentality here that we'll leave the beta tag on this for, I think it's been 5 years now. I think Gmail has us beat though. So just to give you an idea, a policymaker, they can go in here, they can change the policy parameters, and they can get an estimate of the budgetary effects. Just for fun, let's raise the Social Security payroll tax rate. That thing's going bankrupt, so we better help it. And we'll just do that for now. Show me the results. So what's actually happening here is we're running a model on AWS, and I'll show you where you can access that model in a second. We're just calculating taxes for a whole bunch of individuals on what we hope is a representative data set under current law, and then we're changing the law in our program, and then we're calculating taxes again for all the individuals, and we're summing the tax liabilities under the baseline and the reform and telling you the result. You'll also see if you go on there that there are a variety of dynamic modeling options that are available where you can go into some, like an overlapping generations model of the economy or some sort of partial equilibrium models. You can go on there and estimate different dynamic responses with those. The source code for the model that's running right now is available on GitHub in the Policy Simulation Library, which is a library of open policy analysis tools. The one we're running right now is called Tax Calculator. You can go in here and you can actually see all the source code, and I can guarantee you that none of the congressmen that we work with has ever gone to GitHub to do this, but some of their staffers have. And so there is value in this open approach. I think one of the things we were seeing in the last few years was that there was some credibility crisis for CBO and JCT. I don't think it was caused by faulty analysis in any way, but it was caused by political whirlwinds that have been going around. And having the open source angle has been helpful for credibility as well. It's very likely to think, okay, American Enterprise Institute, kind of right-leaning, no one on the left is going to trust the results. But that hasn't been the case at all. We have users on both sides of the aisle. During the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act debate, we had Democrats, Republicans, White House users. I'm just trying to give you an appetite of a sense of the appetite of who cares about these things. And it's pretty much like all the major players you would think you would want to be paying attention to open policy analysis. They all pay attention to open policy analysis if you provide it to them. Same thing with the journalists. We had CNN, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post. They're all using these tools. And it's not that these tools are better than what the Joint Committee on Taxation is providing or what the CBO is providing, but they're open and they're available and you can get the results that you want when you want them. And that's been very helpful for our users. And I can't tell you exactly what the perfect way to do open policy analysis is, but I can tell you that when you make it, they'll come because it's been a valuable tool. And so going back to TaxBrain, so this is the kind of results that the policymakers get. It's very similar to the results that you would get from a Joint Committee on Taxation estimate of tax policy. You get revenue. We're seeing that essentially what you'd expect here. Individual income tax liability goes down a little bit because of an interaction between the payroll tax and the individual income tax. And then you can go down and you can see how the tax is affecting different income groups. We can look at the reform, we can look at current law. And just this is a very basic analysis, but it's more than what the policymakers have available to them right now. Since the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, we've been mostly focused on trying to expand to some other policy areas. The way the Open Source Policy Center works is we're basically an incubator. We help projects get off the ground, and then we sort of give them some guidance for how open source projects can maintain themselves in the future. We're now incubating an opioid cost model for seeing the geographic variation in the costs of the opioid epidemic across different counties. A UBI model for analyzing universal basic incomes, both in the context of tax reform and also in the context of welfare reform, and a few other projects. We're also, the thing that I won't say I'm most excited about, but I'm very excited about right now, is the Policy Simulation Library itself, which we recently created as a home for a number of open source projects for policy analysis. And this is nice because policymakers and their staffs in particular don't have the time or the resources to go hunting all over for the model that they need at any given time. So the extent that people working in open policy analysis can try to create these groups of models where there are some criteria that all of the models meet, and when you're going in, you kind of know what to expect. If you go to pslmodels.org, you can see what those criteria are. This sort of these sort of criteria and having a standardized approach to, okay, I'm going to go in, I'm going to get these models, I know what I'm getting, I'm going to have some guidance on how to use it, it's going to look kind of like the last model I used. All of those little things you can do to improve the user interface are extremely important. It was very tempting when we were getting started in this to just focus completely on, we're open, we're better, transparency is good, that's what you need. But it turns out that you really have to work on the user interface and the user experience because the clients that you're working for are very busy, and trying to make things easy for them will increase adoption a lot. That's true both for the policymakers and the journalists. I'm extremely excited about the initiative here because I think the team at BITS has the talent to reach a much wider group of policymakers than what we can necessarily reach at the Open Source Policy Center, where as an incubator we're focused on a small number of models and working with a particular audience, in our case primarily federal policymakers, but through projects like through the BITS MOOC, through these 22,000 people that have been reached, that provides the kind of infrastructure that you need if you want to take these sorts of open policy analyses framework to either different state governments, city governments, international governments. There's this huge realm of people who are not being served with these types of models yet. And then even at the federal policy level, we've created a tiny fraction of the number of models that are there, the breadth of models that would be helpful to our users. And then just one last thing on the data front. I agree, it's huge. Right now, there's the census has a push to adopt this differential privacy in the Census Bureau, and I recommend keeping an eye on that because it's going to have pretty significant implications for other administrative agencies. I've already seen the IRS is starting to slow down some projects to follow with, to see what happens with what's going on at the Census Bureau. So that's worth keeping an eye on. Things like the AEI data policy, those are also hugely helpful in this. I think one reason for, Kevin probably won't want to comment on this from the CBO, but I think one reason for the recent CBO transparency efforts is that there was a bill in both the House and the Senate with quite a few co-sponsors that, not in these words, but it basically says, why don't you try following the AEA data policy? It's the strong model for the strong example that the legislators were following when they put together a proposal called the CBO Show Your Work Act was the AEA data policies. And so things like that, leadership through academia can also be extremely valuable in these. So if you want to learn more, ospc.org or pslmodels.org or github.com, pslmodels. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much for having me, Fernando. Excited to be here. So I wanted to talk a bit about GiveWell. So first I'll just give some of the basics on what GiveWell is and our relationship to the open policy analysis work. So basically GiveWell is a nonprofit that does research on charities to help donors decide where to donate their money. We publish our full analyses online for free and anyone can use our research. In 2017, about $115 million went to GiveWell's recommended charities as a result of our research, with about $75 million of that coming from a foundation called Good Ventures, and the remaining coming from a number of wealthy individuals and smaller donors. So our list of top charities currently has 8 charities on it. Most of those work on global health, a mix of reducing malaria and deworming, and then one of them provides direct cash transfers. So, transparency is a core part of our mission. So there's different aspects of our work that I could go deeper on, and we could talk about in the discussion. But some examples of them are we make public probabilistic forecasts about the outcomes of the grants that we make. We have detailed reports on the charities we recommend and how the academic evidence applies to the work that they're doing. But the part of our work that most clearly illustrates GiveWell's experience with open policy analysis, and that I'll focus on in this discussion, is our cost effectiveness analysis. So for each charity, we produce a detailed model that tries to reach a bottom line on how cost effective that charity's activities are in terms of cost per outcome achieved. So something like dollars to avert a death from malaria, or dollars to double a very poor household's consumption. We place a large amount of weight on our explicit cost effectiveness analysis, I think probably in a way that's relatively unusual among funders. It plays a major role in how much funding each of the charities get. It also plays a role in which of the charities recommend. So we're generally looking for charities that are at least 2 to 3 times more cost effective than just providing direct cash transfers in order for that charity to become a top charity. A few of the major things that we do to be open about our cost effectiveness analysis, and maybe I can just pull it up here real quick, if I can use this computer properly. Let's see. Yeah. So you can see that it's just right on our site. We publish our full model here. May take a second to load. So it's just in Google Sheet form, so relatively easy to digest. Just to give you a glance at what some of the sheets look like. Here's our BedNets model, and you can see kind of the specific inputs and how we multiply through to get to a bottom line number. And the results tab here just gives you the relative cost effectiveness of particular charities relative to cash transfers. Each of these tabs provides a lot more detail, but that's kind of our core model. And we explain where all the assumptions and inputs are coming from. There's a lot of footnotes, a lot of citations in this sheet, so you can see how we're getting to what we're talking about here. We've also published a video explainer of our model and have some documentation that's linked from the sheet that you can see about our general philosophy. So if you just scroll down here, you'll see that we've got a little video walkthrough down here that's posted on YouTube. And then we also publish a change log. You can see how our model changes over the course of the year. We've published 16 updates to the model this year. You can see, each of these changes and how it affects the bottom line. So let's just, take a look at this one, for example. Fairly substantial change. This charity got 50% more cost effective as a result of this change we made to our model. And you can see just every change we made over the course of the year and what impact it had. So those are the basic ways that we try to be open about our model. So we try to share the full thing. We try to explain it to people, and we try to show how it's changing and why. I think one reason that I think being public about our cost effectiveness analysis is important is that it forces us to be open about the key judgment calls that we're making, and that every policymaker I think needs to make, but that I think are easy to sweep under the rug. So we haven't seen nearly as much public discussion on some of the key inputs in our model as we would like to see. So just a couple of examples of those. One would be what we call internal and external validity adjustments. So those are adjustments that we make to get a best guess of a charity's impact in a particular context. So for example, with the deworming charity, external validity factors include the intensity of worm infections in the area that the charity is working. And there can be pretty wide variation in the cost effectiveness of deworming charities depending on where they're working. And so we make that explicit. You can see that in our model, how we're doing that in each location. But we haven't seen as much discussion of that in sort of the wider discussion of that program. And I think that's a really important input in our model. And second, we have what you could call an internal validity adjustment, which is, if you ran a lot more studies on deworming, what's the probability that you would get similar replication of the sorts of income results that we include in our model? And so we sort of take a best guess of what the true income effect is, and we try to explain how we get there as well. And so, we recommend deworming on the basis that we expect that it's, highly cost effective in a number of areas, but I think our analysis tries to take into account the specific factors in each case, the specific costs in each case, And that's something that I think we've had to do, and with relatively little work to go off of, because there just isn't as much discussion of that kind of input as I would like to see. So a second example of a key input judgment call that we have to make is, obviously, if you're comparing charities that avert deaths from malaria to charities that provide cash transfers, you need to have some kind of comparison between those two outcomes. And so we call these moral weights. They're basically the moral judgment calls that every policymaker has to make because there's limited resources, and so you're always implicitly trading off between different outcomes. And we are explicit about that in our model, about how much weight we're putting on these different outcomes and what that means for how it's driving our bottom line. And donors can look at those weights and say, if I had a different judgment call, what would that mean for which charity I prefer? And so that's another example of, I think the kind of analysis that I'd be interested to see more discussion of, because I think it does play a big role in conclusions about where to donate and other policy as well. So, I wanted to highlight that I think the benefits of openness haven't necessarily been what we expected at the start. I think a couple of the major benefits are that it helps our work to be more rigorous, since other staff members can easily vet it, and people know that when they're putting these models together that they need to cite their sources carefully, and it's going to be published. And I think it helps donors feel confident in our research, since they can see the full analysis and could dig into it if they wanted to, or if they just wanted to select some slice of it and dig in there. It should be possible to do. But I'd say we haven't gotten a lot of high quality engagement on our analysis from people external to the organization yet. So we're not really getting the wisdom of the crowds type benefit that I think is possibly implicit in some of the goals of the open policy analysis work. So, my hope is that if norms shift in favor of there being more interest in open policy analysis in the future, that in the long run, we'll see a couple benefits. One is, more engagement on analysis like ours. There are $115 million each year going to our recommended charities on the basis of, a lot of things in addition to this model, but this model plays a major role. And so I think anyone could go in and find errors or publish arguments about, why we should have a different input in a certain place, and that really could affect where we give, and I think that would be a socially valuable thing for more people to be doing. I think if there were more of a norm around a lot of people publishing these types of analyses and debating them, then hopefully we'd start to see that. And second, I hope it does become the norm to publish models like what we're talking about here, so that there can be more debate on some of the key judgment calls that I was talking about. I think if other major donors or institutions were to publish models, that it would be worth GiveWell staff time, for example, to dig in and say, all right, how does our estimate of bed nets compare to their estimate, and are they not giving as much because they're not considering this benefit that we think is really important, or some judgment call like that. And similarly, I hope that in academic cost effectiveness analysis that those analyses can become more transparent, because we do rely on those when we're thinking about I think those are often helpful to us when we're thinking about which programs should we investigate more deeply. And it's oftentimes hard to go back into the details of those papers and say, all right, how are they actually getting to their conclusion? Where would they differ from us? And so, I'd also be excited to see more movement on that front. So that's what I had for now. Happy to get into more discussion. Thanks.
So now we're gonna plug in Kevin remotely. He is here. And what do we do now?
Hey everybody.
All right. Is that? There you go. That's us. There you go. The volume, how is it? Can you talk a little bit?
Yeah, sure. Is the volume okay? Perfect. Well, thank you so much for inviting me, Fernando. It's great to be with you all. I wish I was there in person, but this is great that we were able to make this work. So I'd first like to just start off by giving a quick overview of CBO and the kind of work that we do, though many of you may be already familiar with that. But then I also want to spend some time talking about some of our recent efforts that we've been undertaking to help promote transparency in our work. So first off, CBO is a support agency that was created by the Congress for the Congress. It was created in 1974 to provide the Congress with objective, timely, nonpartisan analyses on the US economy and the federal budget. One feature that may surprise some of you, but perhaps some of you already know, is that in order to maintain its full objectivity in its analyses, CBO makes no policy recommendations to the Congress. We feel like that's a very important feature of our organization, and it forces us to just give the facts as best as we can see them to the Congress to help them make the most informed decisions that are possible for them to make. In an average year, CBO produces between 500 and 700 formal cost estimates. In addition to that, we produce hundreds of informal cost estimates and about 100 reports, working papers, slide decks, testimonies, letters, issue briefs, data visualizations, and virtually everything that we produce is publicly available on our website at www.cbo.gov. If I were there, I would be showing you all the stuff that I'll be showing you shortly. But I just want to point out that since its inception, CBO has worked to make its analyses accessible and easy to understand. In fact, there's this great memo from the founding director, Alice Rivlin, who wrote around 1975 a memo that stressed that when we're creating our reports should be lucidly written and comprehensible to non-economists. And furthermore, she said, we should break with the ponderous prose of most official economic writing and aim to give members of Congress something that they can read and understand. And so we work very hard at this communication channel of relaying the analyses, the foundations, the data, and presenting things in, like Matt said, the members of Congress are not checking out GitHub, but they are very much interested in seeing the results of analyses. Hey, that's better. Hi, everyone. This is a key effort at CBO constantly is to improve our communications of very technical and challenging things. And so although openness and accessibility has always been a founding principle of the work that we do at CBO, we've recently been devoting even more resources to make our work more accessible. And so today I'm going to talk about three of them specifically that have already been highlighted by the discussion that Hillary, Matt, and Josh have already had. So I'm going to try and keep this relatively short so that we can get to the questions. But I would like to talk a little bit about the data that we released already, some of the interactive tools that we've created, and then releasing the source code for some of our analyses which we've done in this past summer. So the first I want to talk about is the data that we released. CBO releases a lot of data. Our largest repository of data are not surprisingly related to the budget and economic data sources that we have. We have our 10-year budget projections going back for over a decade on our website. In addition, we have data on our long-term budget projections, our trust fund projections, our revenue and spending projections by specific categories, and our macroeconomic projections. And then with numerous reports, we also release supplemental data. Primarily, all of these data files are released as Excel files, but recently we've been starting to release some of our data as CSV files for researchers who are actually interested in then taking our output data and reading in the data into their statistical software package of choice, and then doing their own analyses with our data. And then finally, for every data visualization that we produce, there's a data set underlying all the data that go into that. The next thing I want to talk about, I really wish I was there so that I could open up a bunch of these interactive tools that we've recently created that we're very excited about. The first is what we call our macroeconomic rule of thumb tool, and this allows users to change assumptions about certain macroeconomic variables and see how they filter through and what their budgetary effects are given holding everything else fixed. So some of the things that we allow users to play with essentially is the assumptions about productivity growth, about the growth of labor force participation, interest rates, and inflation. So those are the kind of four most salient macroeconomic variables that a user is allowed to tweak and play with and see what the budgetary effects in terms of the deficit and debt are. The second interactive model that we've released is what we call our waterfall model because of the way the data filters through over time and it allows users to kind of simulate how CBO projects spending outlays for discretionary spending programs over the 10-year budget window, and how budget authority gets translated to actual outlays. And then finally, the last tool that we've created recently is our Force Structure tool, which is an interactive web app that allows users to kind of tweak the size and composition of the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force, and see how those changes would affect the costs of the federal defense budget, and then allow the users to simply click on a button and download a CSV file with their newly specified allocation for military resources. So those are 3 very new tools that we have up on our website, and we have a new section of our website devoted to those tools called at cbo.gov/interactives. And then finally, I want to talk a little bit about the code that we released. This is kind of a very new area, and I think perhaps the area that Fernando was most excited about, and when he invited me to be part of this panel. This past summer, we released 2 separate code sources. The first was released in July and was related to methodology that we have developed for adjusting survey data for the undercount and receipt of means tested transfers. There's a CSV data file from the CPS and some Stata code to go along with that, that will allow users to replicate our distributional results from that analysis. And the second accompanied a working paper about the projections of how CBO estimates potential output for the U.S. economy, and that is a set of Excel data files and eViews code. So, this was again a big step in us, showing our work and being as transparent as we possibly can be with our analyses. And I think it's some pretty, a step in the right direction for a lot of the stuff that you guys are all chatting about today. And I'm excited to be here to participate in this conversation. And like I said, although CBO has been releasing data for a while, the new features of what we've been putting out, the interactive tools and the releasing of source code, are relatively new to us. And as such, we're particularly interested in collecting feedback from other organizations that are promoting open policy analysis, and from learning from their experiences to help guide us as we continue to make our work more and more transparent. So I'm going to just keep it brief and wrap up there, and thank you again for inviting me to participate, and I'm really, really looking forward to the conversation that comes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kevin. I think we're gonna leave you unmute so we can all talk. Hopefully it's not gonna create like some strange feedback stuff. But how much time do we have left?
About 10 minutes.
10 minutes, okay. 10 minutes for conversation. I will first like to open up to the floor if somebody has some questions that they would like to ask. If not, I have a ton of questions that I would like to start with. Yes.
This is thank you all. So this question is primarily for Hillary, but for the other folks working in the federal agencies. What are are there efforts afoot to overcome some of the rules that silo the data in these different agencies? I mean, we have the Evidence-Based Policy Commission, and we have evidence efforts in the OMB. We have lots of great things happening. But this dilemma where HUD can't talk to education is a major sticking point. And I'm just wondering if that's do any of you see there's a next step, efforts afoot, strategies in place?
So we tackled that in our recommendations, and right now, since the completion of the Commission on Evidence-Based Policymaking, the Bipartisan Policy Center is basically leading the effort to continue sort of the translation of the ideas from the Commission to Congress. So there's actually a bill that's sort of the first pass, what they call the down payment legislation. I'm not a Washington person, but I guess that's a term. Sort of like the beginning, some of the easy stuff that I keep on getting emails saying, it's going to get added as a rider on something or other next week, but then it hasn't happened yet. So basically there's somebody who's sort of carrying the ideas that we tried to tackle about precisely what are the key things that need to be reformed in order to start to make some big progress. And so I think that it's going to take time, but I think that it's pretty straight ideas about how to get there.
Thank you very much. If I remember correctly, when I was reading about the Commission on Evidence-Based Policy, it was very encouraging to see both sides of the aisle getting behind this, at least on paper. One thing that seemed a little noticeable to me was that we're very interested in evidence-based policy as long as carbon taxes and climate change aren't involved, or gun policy or firearms. Maybe I'm misremembering it. It seemed like they're interested in a certain slice of evidence, focused on a certain slice of policies. And likewise, I think it's very interesting to hear that there seems to be bipartisan appreciation for open policy and tax. But what lessons are you learning if both sides of the aisle can agree on evidence for policy, for some policies? What's missing for these other discussions? What do we need to add to the mix to get people more broadly, generically interested in evidence for policy rather than some evidence for some policy?
I mean, I'll just quickly say a few words, but probably I'm not the best person to talk about this given the panel. But I think we tried to kind of we tried to assert principles and give examples of how to follow them through, as opposed to sort of calling out particular domains that were particularly closed versus open. So we tried to sort of establish principles, and if you understand the transitive property, you would know what we were including in our projections. But there were a couple of real third rails that we called out in particular, and oddly, I still don't really understand why. The national assembling the UI labor market data that individual states collect, and basically as a panel of labor market information on individuals, is considered we were told we shouldn't talk about it, but we did. So I think our strategy anyways was to just try to establish basic principles and not be super specific about everything that we wanted, but instead lay out the principles.
So picking up on that question and on your responses, I think I have yeah. So basically, Matt gave a very good example of what could be a controversial topic, tax policy. My understanding is that some of your work has been picked up from people not only of right-wing ideological leanings. That was my reading of your work. And my question would be, if an analysis on climate change or on gun control on a more heavily controversial topic would come out of a right-wing or left-wing think tank with this framework, would that make it more digestible to the other side of the aisle? That's one of the...
I don't have any pessimism about this at all. My sense is that we're just really early on and people building open source tools for policy analysis, and just no one's built an open source tool for gun analysis yet. If someone did, then it'd be welcome in the policy simulation library, to the extent that I'm one of the maintainers and have commit access. And same thing with climate change. A lot of climate models are available from the EPA. I don't think there's anything specific to carbon taxes, but I think policymakers really appreciate any analyses that they can get their hands on, and so it's just a matter of having folks who can get the data and then build the model, rather than people shying away just because it's a little scary of a topic.
Question?
So I know that one of the conversations going on in the demographic community is about how increased computational ability is making it more difficult to have the kind of protections on census microdata, the ability to link and identify people through modern computation. That there are concerns about whether micro-census data will be available and so forth. And I wonder whether any of you have any thoughts about how this sort of, on the one hand, what you all sounds great, the idea, and you're providing models and so forth, and those are of course not suspect, but the underlying data, there are, I think, questions about our ability to maintain the confidentiality and the inability to link to individuals. So any of you struggling with that issue, and do you have any answers?
It's a big issue right now. I think in my view, it means that the transparency of CBO and JCT and other government analytical agencies is even more important. If you think that there's some finite privacy budget the society has for these administrative data, and that privacy budget is being eaten up by some of these analyses by these agencies, then it means that them conducting useful analyses and using their privileged access, like CBO and JCT have very good access to administrative data. They have some of the best access. For these agencies that have the best access, I think it means the importance of them being open and transparent with their work is even more important, because there are going to be privacy challenges to getting the same data quality outside of government.
Yeah, I'd like to just add in a little bit on that, in that Matt's absolutely correct in terms of like the difference between the access of data that CBO and JCT have. We have, access to confidential level tax return data and confidential Social Security Administration data, and safeguarding those data sources to prevent any sort of leaks is something that we are very much concerned about in terms of ways that we could potentially, share segments of our code or things like that are related to those models that use those underlying confidential data. And I also want to second what Matt said about the paying close attention to the discussion around these privacy budgets, and that it will have probably very significant effects for researchers' access to the underlying microdata. So it's a very important topic that's closely related to this.
And it ties in very closely with the computational reproducibility conversation on the last panel. So,
yes, it affects the computational reproducibility. We're working on how can you actually make that transparency from a research perspective. But I'm also involved with some of those efforts at the Census Bureau, so biased here potentially. But that conversation, for those in the crowd who are economists who take the annual pleasure of actually going to the AA right after New Year's, there is a presentation that actually has many of the opposing sides there, right, going to discuss that. I think they need a larger room. For those that can't, there's actually a similar presentation this Thursday that's going to be live cast because it's the Census Advisory Committee with the same participants on that kind of thing. The key thing is that these are not independent conversations. The reproducibility of the analysis that researchers are doing, that government agencies are doing in terms of getting at this, and the priority given to those analyses is sort of coming to the fore because we've realized that there is a limited number of things that we can say before we've said everything about everybody and just laid out the microdata. And getting those important analyses or types of models into the conversation is the best way to guarantee that those get recognition within those, because while we are somewhat concerned that there's a limited budget, we have no idea what the size of that budget is. We only know it's limited. And so to set those priorities right and to define as a policy choice how much we value policy analysis versus privacy is an important conversation to have, and everybody should participate in that, because it's not a conversation we've necessarily had in the past.
okay, so we ran out of time, but I wanted to finish up with just one question to tie it to another theme that we're working here at BITS. This applies to those who are doing policy analysis, and I think it mainly applies to Kevin because he's the one that has to produce a more time-constrained analysis, but my understanding is that GiveWell also has to produce something by the end of December, and I don't know what the timeline is in AI, but a component of policy analysis is that sometimes you need to plug in a number that you don't have much data for. We label that as guesswork. Somebody else label it as expert opinions. That is, in some sense, a forecast, an expert forecast. Do you guys have a systematic way to performing that forecast? Do you record that process? I would be very interested to hear first Kevin, and then if we have some time for the rest.
Yeah, so I mean, that's really kind of an important topic that comes up particularly when we're trying to produce estimates of completely new topic areas that we don't have a lot of background literature to consult. And it's one of the pieces that we struggle, mightily for in terms of effectively communicating our uncertainty about these pieces of new information. So, for example, like when we were producing our estimates of the difference, of the costs for Medicare Part D prescription plans, that was a brand new program, and we ended up overestimating the costs of that. And then conversely, when we were estimating the costs for newly eligible Medicaid recipients under the ACA, we didn't get that either correct. We were a little short on that. But I think that one of the things that we also do at CBO is that we kind of retrospectively analyze when we have missed the mark on a lot of our forecasts and do analyses of how well our macroeconomic forecasts have performed, our revenue forecasts have performed, and our spending forecasts have performed. And we, when we don't have, a lot of great insight, we, have to communicate how uncertain we are about it. So it's a struggle. You're absolutely correct.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for allowing me to squeeze that final question. Sorry that we don't have any more time. I'm very happy with this panel. Thank you. Round of applause for everybody.